My buddy Lee Spieckerman is back with us. We always get great buzz every time Lee is on because he takes unconventional positions.
President Trump is exactly right on the trade issue. The establishment Republicans like Paul Ryan are dead wrong. I don't think he's going far enough yet. I think we need a 15% tariff on all imported goods. Leo, when people talk about tariffs being a tax, that's true. But as Ronald Reagan said, when you tax something, you get less of it. We have a huge fiscal crisis coming in this country, massive government deficits going forward. We have to get that revenue. Yes, we have to cut some spending, but that isn't going to be enough. We have got to raise revenue. I would rather tax imports and get less of those, which means more American jobs and more domestic investment, rather than raising income taxes again, which the Democrats want to do. I think the president should declare our trade deficit situation a national economic emergency. That would give him all of the license that he needs to impose whatever tariffs are necessary. We have got to get that yawning trade gap down. It is a catastrophe for our economy. If we had a reasonable tariff regime, a 15% tariff on all imported goods, that would encourage more domestic savings, more investment, and of course more buying American, which we need. Our nearly $800 billion goods trade deficit is costing us 3.5 to 4 million jobs a year, and our workers being undercut from foreign imports and from offshoring of plants owned by Americans has caused a downward wage vortex in this country. That's why middle class incomes have not improved. They've stagnated or actually gone down in real terms over the past 20 years. And that's why President Trump was elected in large measure. You know, at the end of World War II, we had a very high tariff. Even after World War II, we lowered it dramatically to help our allies rebuild after the war. And now we're way past that. And so we need the jobs, we need the revenue. There's no other way we're going to be able to raise the revenue that we need over the next 10 years unless we have a dramatic increase in income taxes or a politically impossible cut in entitlement programs and even discretionary spending. This is crucial for the revenue, and a 15% tariff by historic standards is very little, but it would yield $3 trillion in revenue for our government. That's enough to make all of the middle income tax cuts in the Trump tax relief that was just passed permanent, so they don't expire. Okay. It's enough to fund a repeal and replace of Obamacare. It's enough to seed an infrastructure bank and to keep us from having $1 trillion deficits. Right now, Neil, our country is borrowing or selling valuable American assets to the tune of $500 billion a year just to offset our trade deficit. We have these establishment economists and these clueless politicians who are waxing poetic about free trade, but you notice they never talk about that $800 billion deficit. They don't talk about the nearly 4 million well-paying American jobs that's costing us. If we can just knock $200 billion, 25% off of our goods trade deficit, that would add a full percentage point to our GDP. Remember, growth is the goal, and people forget, and again, these wonderful economists who love to rhapsodize about free trade don't tell us that every dollar that we spend on imports is subtracted from our GDP. So right now, nearly 4% of our GDP growth is hacked away every year by our trade deficit. We have an $800 billion goods trade deficit, a $550 billion overall deficit when you take out services. The other thing we hear a lot about is how wonderful services are. Well, that's great. The trouble is services do not entail nearly as many well-paying middle-class jobs as does manufacturing.
No, you're right about that.
Do you know who the #1 car exporter in America is? BMW. BMW exports more vehicles than any other company. So guess what? They can do a lot more of that. As you know, Toyota and Mazda are building a $1.6 billion plant in the U.S. There's nothing wrong, obviously, with building things in the U.S. We just need policies that make that more attractive. We have the one import that we have a significant tariff on is light trucks, pickup trucks, 25% tariff. Guess what? That is the fulcrum of the American automobile industry. And Toyota makes its trucks here in Texas. The average non-managerial employee at Walmart makes $14 an hour. The average factory worker in the United States makes $24 an hour, $20,000 a year difference, and that is a direct result of our ridiculous trade deal. Unfortunately, we're becoming a nation of cashiers, waiters and baristas. Nothing wrong with any of those jobs.
Right.
Unfortunately, they pay about $12 to $15 an hour.
You want to see higher pay.
24.
You want to see higher pay.
I sure do.
Yeah,
That's crucial. It's not just the dollar flows and the stuff Wall Street worries about. We've got the people that voted for Trump want jobs. They want well-paying jobs. They're starting to come back. Let's finish the job by having a tariff and going back to what our country's had most of its history, which is a trade tariff.
Thank you.
We need to repatriate the American supply chain, and we need to bring those jobs for the components back here. $800 billion trade deficit, 3.5 million jobs. We need that, and we also need the revenue from a trade tariff to make the middle income tax cuts permanent.
We have to make a patriotic pitch then to say to them, this is well worth the sacrifice here. Do you think Americans are willing and ready to do that?
I don't just think it, I know it. It's backed up by polling. A leading Republican pollster, Tariffs,
saying you're going to go on a diet and going on a diet is very different. You don't have to worry about these things. I cannot tell you the number of diets I've committed to do and not done. Telling the Americans, or Americans telling you that they are willing to absorb this punishment and then absorbing it are two different things, my friend.
Well, let me tell you, first of all, the entire tariff will not be passed on to Americans because importers will compress margins and find other ways to cut costs. It's a brutally competitive world economy. That's number one. Number two, no one ever talks about the other side of the equation. We're going to have millions of Americans with either better paying jobs or better incomes because this importing and offshoring orgy that we've had over the past decades has imploded American middle class incomes. Obviously, when you can access workers overseas making $6 a day, that's going to hurt American workers. More companies can build here in the United States. They're already doing it, as you pointed out in the previous segment. They can do a lot more of it. There is no reason for large-scale manufacturing imports in this country, and we need a tariff to advance that process to make our economy stronger. That is a national security issue. That is the only way we're going to be able to afford funding our military and be able to stand up to foreign enemies.
I love you to death. I love you to death, and especially when you use words like orgy when we're talking about trade. But be careful what you wish for. I'm telling you, be careful what you wish for because
I wish for higher incomes and better American jobs.
We'll see you, Mr. Schmatty Pants. Very good seeing you again, Lee. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful weekend. All right, just a little kidding back and forth there, but I know I'm going to hear from people.
You turn on almost any other channel, and they say these tariffs are all bad.
Well, that's the establishment economist and clueless politician approach to trade, and thank God we have a president and President Trump who understands that tariffs on imported goods go back to the founding of our country. They were championed by George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. They are bedrock Republican philosophy going back to the Republican Party's first elected president, Abraham Lincoln. And for most of American history, we had much higher tariffs on imports, and during that period, we built the mightiest economy and the highest standard of living in human history.
Now, to be fair and balanced, we also have to note that the markets have been spooked by the tariffs in some ways, and we've seen uncertainty created by the tariffs. But you pick up the Wall Street Journal this morning, and they have an interesting story about how it looks like maybe the U.S. and China are inching closer to a deal, if they can get some sort of a deal on trade that is more favorable to America, as President Trump has been pushing. I would expect, and you know the markets better than I, that that's going to be a major development in a positive direction.
Well, it is positive if we can reach agreements that are good for our country and that are going to bring back a substantial portion, if not all, of the jobs that have been sucked out of our country. You know, you alluded to China, a $400 billion goods trade deficit, which is, 2 million at least well-paying American jobs. And Ed, the reason this is so important is that a job is not just a production input, which unfortunately is how too many people on Wall Street and too many of their lackeys in the political world approach it. A job is life.
Yes.
And when you have more well-paying American jobs, you have less family violence, you have less addiction, you have less crime, you have healthier communities. So this could be the greatest social program in a generation for our country.
Actually,
but through the private sector,
creating jobs instead of just handing out money, handing out assistance. Lee Spieckerman bringing us some important facts this morning about the economy. We appreciate you coming.
The trade negotiations between the U.S. and China pick up again at the beginning of 2019. So as trade talks are set to resume once again, we thought we would revisit our favorite debate of the year. Watch.
And I love Jonathan. We agree on most issues, but I don't understand why he and other conservatives love income taxes. They have a problem with tariffs.
So he's basically saying, hey, we need these taxes, higher taxes, and that's
we're going to have to raise income taxes,
let me just say,
income taxes are better?
No economist agrees with this. No member of the Federal Reserve.
The economists who got us in the mess that we're in. We have an $800 billion goods trade deficit, a $550 billion overall trade deficit. Don't tell no other major exporter in the G20.
That was, I think, August or September earlier this year. And look who we got here headed into the new year. Spieckerman Media President Lee Spieckerman and Capitalist Pig co-founder Jonathan Honig.
We were told that trade wars were good. They were easy to win. They've been anything but, Blake. So, I don't know.
We've been in a trade war for decades, Jonathan, and losing.
Lee can spin this. I don't know. Well, it's... Well,
that's
you're going to say, I know, you're going to say we've been losing money on trade.
In October, we had a record trade deficit, goods trade deficit with China, over $500 billion a year annualized. That is totally unacceptable.
It's not moving much, though, is it?
No, it's gone up. It's gone up since the president started the trade war.
I call myself a capitalist patriot, as is President Trump.
Read some Henry Hazlitt, read Adam Smith, read any economist who would tell you that taxing Americans.
All of those.
That's exactly. Well, you're saying you're celebrating the tariff man.
Adam Smith never endorsed unfettered free trade. He wanted to reduce tariffs, and he assumed that all of the countries would operate according to the same rules. China is not. Oh no, China is not operating by the rules. China is not operating by the rules. China is feeling the heat. You talked about the stock market. The Dow Jones Industrials are down year to date 9 to 10%. The Chinese indexes are down 25%, more, almost three times as much as our stock market has declined. You bet I am, because we have been hosed by China. Jonathan, you're the voice of the American economic elite. I'm talking about the other 99% of America. The trade surplus that China is piling up with America is funding its military. They are funding the research to destroy
let me just say this, Lee. You worked for President Bush. Let me just get a word in edgewise. We've heard the Trump talking points.
Jonathan, go. Respond to that. Go.
Lee, we've heard the Trump talking points. I mean, President Bush. Yeah. You worked for President Bush, I believe, somewhere along the line. The first President Bush actually tried these steel.
I worked with his nephew.
He's on your Twitter feed, I know that. The first President Bush actually tried these steel and aluminum tariffs way back in 2002. They thankfully gave them up, Blake, after a year, after they saw that they were costing American consumers money and Americans jobs. This issue on tariffs has been settled. This was settled decades ago in economic history.
It was settled by China. They took advantage of a system. They have had a predatory trade system. We have lost at least 2 million well-paying jobs since China has come into the World Trade
let me ask you. Let me ask you. You have no concern.
2 million well-paying American jobs. You may not care about that at your hedge fund, but the average American does care about that.
Oh yes, and here goes the class warfare. The rich hedge fund. Here goes the class warfare.
Hold on. Let me jump in here for a second. Hold on, Jonathan. Hold on. Lee, are you worried though that some prices have gone up? Simple question. Because some of this is passed on to the consumer.
We are at a very low, a record low inflation rate still in this country overall. Most of those tariff price related increases will not be passed on because we're in a brutal world economy. The producers and the importers will cut costs in other ways. And by the way, when you have more jobs and better American incomes, there is more money to buy goods and services. That's what we need. And China has got to move to a sustainable, wait a minute, China has got to move to a realistic economic model, which is that they consume most of their own products, not have a predatory trading practice with the rest of the world. What they have is unsustainable. We are borrowing $500 billion a year or selling American assets.
Has the president, let me ask you,
Jonathan, I gotta get
with China.
I got to get out of here. So
$500 billion.
The last
and
question.
Like that doesn't matter. 2 million jobs doesn't matter. Yeah, it matters a lot if you're not.
We got to run real quick. But Jonathan, last question to you, since I asked Lee about concerns. Are you concerned at all whatsoever that if the president doesn't confront China, then China's practices are just going to continue with no end in sight whatsoever? 20 seconds to you to end.
China's protectionism hurts China. The reason America has always been the most successful country is that we've always been the most free. And Lee is right about one thing. China has come a great deal since the 1990s.
We've had higher tariffs for almost all of our history.
Let me just get one word.
That's what built America.
Let me get one word in here, Lee.
We had
let me get one word in here. here, if you don't mind.
World War II, we had a 20%,
yeah,
26%
let me just get one word in, Lee, here.
After World War II.
The reason China has improved since the 1990s is because they've liberalized their economy. They've freed up their economy. We're moving in just the opposite direction here. We were told trade wars were good, easy to win, and all the benefit has been a loss of dollars in American jobs.
Lee, Jonathan?
They've stolen 2 million American jobs. That's why they've succeeded. And they are sucking $500 billion a year out of America every year to fund their military.
Guys,
you don't get trade.
I gotta jump in. We could probably let this go all afternoon long, but we'll have all 2019 to talk about it as well.
Listen, so you can go on for longer than that.
2 million jobs, $500 billion a year. No big deal.
Hold on. Thank you to you both. We appreciate both of your views, both of you coming in.
Always a pleasure.
I hope both of you have a happy New Year 2019.